the acquisition workforce is necessary, but not sufficient to modernize software development and deployment. Resourcing must be available to provide flexible budgeting, rapid and continuous authority to operate, and leadership must demand that all relevant authorities, procedures, and processes are employed. My submitted testimony goes into more details on these items. I would like to close by acknowledging 3 efforts that are producing actionable recommendations that might be useful to this subcommittee. One is the Commission on Planning, Programming, Budgeting, and Execution, who just last week produced our final report. Chairman Rogers and Ranking Member Smith held a hearing in which we talked about recommendations that could be employed. Many would help our software initiatives. 2, the Software Defense Coalition, that is led by Jane Lee, is producing actionable recommendations for this subcommittee. And finally, the Atlantic Council Commission on Software-Defined Warfare, on which I serve, is again producing actionable recommendations. I urge the committee to follow up on these. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Lord. Dr. Murray, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Luttrell, Mr. Khanna, and distinguished members of the subcommittee, thank you for inviting me to speak with you this morning on the topic of software development in the Department of Defense. From 2016 to 2021, I was a member of the Defense Innovation Board, and I co-chaired, along with Michael McQuaid, the DIBS study on software acquisition and processes, which we call SWAP. This was established in the 2018 NDAA, and our report was titled Software is Never Done, and it was released in May of 2019. One of the key findings of our report was that Congress and DoD have been talking about the importance of software and struggling with how to make better use of software in support of national security for decades. In many ways, the DIB report of 2019 was just a rephrasing of the 1987 Defense Science Board Task Force on Military Software, written 32 years earlier, which identified itself over 30 previous studies on that same topic. As we described in our report, Chapter 3, been there, said that, we know what we need to do. We just need to figure out how to actually do it and get to it. In our 2019 report, we identified 3 themes that I believe are still the most important points to make about getting software right. The first is that speed and cycle time are the most important metrics for software. Being able to develop and deploy faster than our adversaries means that we can provide more advanced capabilities, respond to our adversaries' moves, and be more responsive to end users. Faster reduces risk, leads to increased reliability, and gives us a tactical advantage on the battlefield by allowing operation and response inside our adversaries' OODA loop: observe, orient, decide, and act. Second, software is made by people and for people, so digital talent matters. DoD resource policies are often not conducive to attracting, retaining, and promoting digital talent. Talented software developers and acquisition personnel with software experience are often put in jobs that did not allow them to make use of those talents, particularly in the military, where rotating job assignments may not recognize and reward the importance of software development experience. Today, in DoD and the industrial base that supports it, the people with the necessary skills exist, but instead of taking advantage of their skills, we often put them in environments where it is difficult for them to be effective. Third, software is different than hardware, and not all software is the same. Over the years, Congress and DoD have established a sophisticated set of statutes, regulations, and instructions that govern the development, procurement, and sustainment of defense systems. But software development is fundamentally different than hardware development. And software should be developed, deployed, tested, and continuously improved using much different cycle time, support infrastructure, and maintenance strategies. Software is never done and must be managed as an enduring capability that is treated differently than hardware. In preparing for this meeting, I took the opportunity to read recent GAO reports on the implementation of some of the recommendations from the SWAP study, which we partnered with Ms. Lord on when she was in the DoD. I was pleased to see that Congress and DoD have made substantial progress in implementing many of our recommendations, including establishing new acquisition pathways for software and exploring new appropriation categories that allow software to be funded as a single budget item. These are important steps, and they should be continued and accelerated if we're going to get software right. In addition to these important actions that focused on the acquisition process, DoD implemented many actions on other primary and secondary recommendations from our report. Some of the most important are developing guidance on authority to operate, ATOs, including ATO reciprocity and continuous ATOs, which enable continuous integration and deployment pipelines. As of April 2023, it appears that guidance for continuous ATOs has not yet been published, and I would encourage the DoD to do so if it hasn't already. Another area of high importance is recruiting digital talent. DoD reports progress in establishing software factories that combine personnel from specialized teams, but it appears they have yet to establish a separate career track for software developers, something that we recommended. A well-defined career track for software developers, including service members, will allow DoD to train and retain the skilled workforce necessary to design, build, and test modern software systems. Finally, an area that's completely different today than it was 5 years ago when we did the SWAP study is the role of artificial intelligence in military systems. The implications of AI will be profound across all areas of society, and the field is changing so rapidly that it's impossible to predict how AI is going to progress over anything more than the next few years. In the context of software development, AI is poised to revolutionize the way we write, test, and deploy code. Modern large language models, LLMs, are already writing code based on descriptions of the desired function and are being used in industry to speed development. In the future, they will be integral to testing, deployment, and protection of software as well. These developments will democratize software development in ways that have a potential to drastically reduce cycle time, both for the U.S. and for our adversaries. At the same time, software that is used for military systems is too critical to fail, and so we must find ways to harness those tools that fit the increased levels of security and safety that are required in safety and mission-critical systems. DoD must stay on top of these developments and take advantage of current U.S. leadership being developed in the commercial sector. Congress, working with DoD, plays an essential role in moving forward and breaking us out of the cycle of repeating for the last 32 years. Thank you for your attention, and I look forward to our discussion.
Thank you, Dr. Murray. Dr. Pratt, you're recognized for 5 minutes, sir.
Thank you for inviting me here to speak on such an important topic. I'm here in an individual capacity, but I serve in diverse roles, offering me perspectives on the cutting edge of national security technology and threats, the broad techno-economic shifts which are reshaping the global order, and the vibrant commercial tech ecosystem. As you all know, software is ubiquitous. Its powerful implications for economic productivity, for government effectiveness, for cybersecurity, and the character of national security. And these technological changes are overlaid on the geopolitical context of our time, strategic competition between the United States and the People's Republic of China. And the crux of the problem for national security is this. In a sustained competition, in a long-term competition, advantage ultimately depends on the ability of one side to adapt, move by move, year by year, mitigating weaknesses in building advantage. The kinds of questions that we end up with in the military dimension of competition are things like, are our weapon systems relevant against a relentless pace of new threats? Can commanders access data to control highly distributed forces? Can we invent new ways of fighting that put the PRC on the back foot and dissuade aggression? These are the issues that the Department of Defense must tackle if it wants to compete. And now every one of these issues now depends on software. Even changing a military unit's tactics now depends on a software update, not just a whiteboard planning session. And we need look no further than the battlefields of Ukraine to find evidence that units which are able to change their software more quickly see better outcomes. So we face a choice. We can be victims of software, cursing its bugs and delays and overruns, or we can harness it for competitive advantage by leveraging American ingenuity, a robust talent base, and leading technology. That's our question. Can we create a defense system built for evolution and adaptation, a defense system built to compete? My central message is this, and it will echo those of my fellow witnesses here. The process of getting code from a programmer to an operational system is critical. This is what's so different about software. We blur the lines between what is development, building something, and what is operations, using that same thing. So making this quick and robust is a necessary condition for competition. And there are a handful of forward-leaning trailblazers in the department doing this well today, but they remain in the minority, and they face daily struggles against organizations and processes built for another era. So I call your attention to 2 actionable items for oversight. First, enabling rapid software deployment and updates through the ATO process, as we've discussed, where, again, ATO refers to the process of how the department decides that software is safe to deploy and use. The second item, talent, attracting qualified technical expertise to guide DoD's software development and procurement. On the first topic, I'll introduce an analogy. In many ways, making software resembles a potter molding wet clay and forming it into some finished piece. When an engineering team works with source code, it acts like wet clay. They can quickly adjust it, make fixes. But once the code is compiled, built, shipped, it becomes fixed and brittle. The executable code only works on one particular type of processor, has many fixed assumptions about its operating conditions. And what we find is modern software is so complex, it has so many dependencies that you need to feed the results back to the engineering team. You need a cycle. And unfortunately, our ATO process often makes this quite difficult. So this is addressed in greater detail in my written statements. On the second topic, technical talent, software is a complex and technical subject matter. Details matter. The bits matter. So we hear these clickbait headlines sometimes, like one simple trick can solve DoD software, like use Kubernetes or get to the cloud or one software factory to rule them all or just hire Silicon Valley where it's all about agile. Those are all great tools. Those are useful things, but navigating that complexity requires judgment and organic technical talent on the part of the department. The DoD needs a few top-tier technical leaders driven by mission, doesn't need armies of CAC badge coders, and it can attract this talent if given the right tools, using things like term appointments, and giving these people autonomy to make a mission impact. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Patt. We'll move into questioning. I'll open up. Authority to operate, y'all three hit on that. It seems, and I hate to say, it seems almost as, and you guys shouldn't leave. I'm going to talk to you guys if you want to hang out. Yeah, totally cool. Sit back down. The authority to operate, I don't necessarily mean, it seems like it's the improper medium for software innovation into the department because software is updated every half second of every minute of every hour of every day. Correct. I mean, it just moves so fluidly. For the past 40 years, the authority to operate seems to be bogging the system down. I'm asking three subject matter experts. We'll start with you, Mr. Pratt, or Ms. Lord. We'll start with you ladies first. What's the fix? And I don't want something hanging on the wall that we talked about. I don't want a report that we don't never read. What is the actual fix to fix this problem? This is the way that we forward lean in front of our adversaries, and we seem to be bogging. The system is failing itself, sounds like. Ms. Lord?
The challenge is the need for speed, and I believe there are two things that we need to do. Is one, move to continuous ATOs. There's been a lot written and a lot discussed, but continuous ATOs are not yet implemented. And I would suggest that during posture hearings, this would be a very good thing to ask DoD leadership about. Secondly, we are repeatedly across even programs, military services, agencies, not allowing reciprocal rights for ATOs, so the same software is being reauthorized again and again. Those are the two key things that I think you should push on.
So breaking down the silos between the multiple departments.
Absolutely, and not looking at discrete, repetitive approvals. Right now, in fact, there is only a requirement to approve 12 systems a year, which, given the fact that most of our systems run on hardware, software, and data, is frightening.
Dr. Murray?
Yeah, I would completely agree. I think when you think about continuous ATO in particular, right, what do we need to be able to do? We need to be able to say, this software needs to be updated. It needs to be updated now. The longer we wait, the more risk we put our warfighters in by not giving them the code they need to do the job they need to do. So how do we get to the point where we are an industry, right, where, if a 0 day comes out, that is some attack on my cell phone that's going to break into my cell phone, there will be an update in the next day or two, right? And that means they've already figured out, how do we put an update out there that's not going to break all of those zones, that's going to satisfy all of our own security things? We need to do that within the DoD. We need to define what that is. I think you should be asking on every program, what is the cycle time that's going into this software? How much of that cycle time is the ATO process, right? And if that ATO process, if that's more than sort of a day, there's a problem, right? Because it needs to be a continuous ATO. It needs to be something where we automatically check, does this satisfy the security requirements? This is important code. We've got to be careful about it, but we need to be able to get out there quickly or we're putting our warfighters at risk.
Dr. Patt?
I agree very much with those comments. It's useful to talk, the ATO is about the risk of using the software, about deploying the software. And this gets aligned with mission risk. And sometimes I feel this point gets lost. If it's buying body armor, you can really separate these decisions of, did I buy the body armor and does it meet the spec? And is it safe to use this on a mission? Does this help support the mission? With software, though, again, these lines get blurred. I will say that one of the places where you see progress in the department is where they try to put these risks together. So if you look at, in the Navy, PEO IWS or PMW 150, there are program officers and program managers which both own the risk of use of the software on the operational network and the development of the software. When you move those things together, you tend to get these more mission-focused outcomes. These are the organizations which have been successfully able to use continuous ATOs. And I would expect that, that same characteristic to carry us forward. As Dr. Murray said, we often focus on ATOs, like this old-fashioned boxed software model, and we forget the risk of not updating the software, of not deploying new features, which will make us more successful in our mission. And we become too focused on compliance, checking the boxes of, did we meet the boxes that we said we would when we shipped that software? And we forget the underlying problems of, we're trying to conduct a mission here. And the most important thing is the cycle time that we keep coming back to. So you can keep updating, adding features, and mitigating problems.
If I may have one quick follow-up on that,
Yes, ma'am.
I think we need to differentiate in the department between risk management and risk elimination. We are never going to eliminate all risk, and these trade-offs are what take human judgment calls and what Dr. Patt is talking about. Also, he called out PEO IWS. I think it's very important for Congress to recognize those individuals in the department who are leaning forward and demonstrating, embracing authorities, policies, procedures. And I would say Admiral Seiko Akana, who I think she's just moving along, PEO IWS, has done that admirably. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Lord. So for all the young men and women sitting behind the witnesses, they're talking to you. You're the next generation that will keep this country ahead of the nefarious actors across the globe. So I highly recommend you play this tape back because we are counting on you. Do you understand? Outstanding. Mr. Connor, you're recognized, sir, for 5 minutes.
They don't just, in my district, when you have a software challenge at Apple or Google, they don't just go out and buy new software. They, in fact, that's the last thing they do. They have a mission and they figure things out. I've heard from people who sold to the DOD or who worked at the DOD that they just buy new software to check off the box that they have complied, but this isn't actually innovating in the way that the private sector does. Could you comment on how we change that culture, other than getting Tim Cook to run these things?
I think it comes down to investing in the human capital at DOD. If individuals are not trained to be smart buyers and we cannot attract contemporary coders and so forth, we will not change that culture. Right now, we have a huge issue, and this is mentioned in our PPBE final report, with modernizing a lot of our business systems. We're pretty good at talking about innovating from a warfighting technology point of view. We typically do not talk about innovating business systems. We need to digitize those systems, and we have to attract individuals who want to work on contemporary COT systems. Right now, we have a hard time attracting a lot of software specialists in the department because we are working on 10, 20, 30-year-old software, and frankly, there's not the knowledge of the art of the possible as to what could be done. So I suggest working with DAU, training the acquisition professionals on what a digital environment really is. Thank you.
So I would say that, I completely agree with you. We can't sort of say, hey, this software is not doing what it's supposed to do, so let's go, specify and put a bunch of requirements and define a new piece of software that's going to do that and go buy that somehow, and 5 years later this thing comes along. I think what you see in Silicon Valley and other places is that we say we need a platform, and that platform is an enduring capability. We're going to be doing search forever. We're going to be delivering apps to cell phones forever. And so we're going to be tracking satellites and tracking debris in space forever. And there's an enduring capability there, and there's software that's going to do that. And we need to think about that platform as something that is going to get updated, new features are going to be added and other things. And we're not going to say, let's sort of write down the requirements for that, buy it, and then it's done, and it's going to sit there for 10, 20 years. It needs to be something we say every year we're going to invest a certain amount of money in that software, in a development team that's going to do that. And we need to create a system in which we sort of think of software as an enduring capability and get into that mindset. It is absolutely possible. We've seen it in the commercial sector. It's part of the reason that the U.S. commercial sector is so far ahead, is that we're just able to jump on all of those things. And so we have to do that within the DoD. I think there are spots that are doing that. We need to, again, as Ms. Lord said, we need to amplify those. We need to recognize those. We need to do that more. One other thing I'll say is, I think that we see some of that starting in the software acquisition pathway, but it's for things that are pure software. So much software is sitting on top of hardware, and the hardware mindset dominates the software that's part of that hardware. We've got to break out of that. That software also needs to be updated. If you're looking at an F-22, there's software on that. Some of that software should stay there for a decade or more, but much of that software is things that should really be updated on a regular basis.
I had one more question, so I'll give you the chance to answer it. If there's a company and they're awarded a second phase SBIR grant, a lot of the startups do, then they often are waiting for a year, year and a half to get the SBIR 3. And this is the valley of death in Silicon Valley for a lot of startups. Is there a way that you could authorize the contracting officer to at least give a letter of intent to possibly give that they're going to get the grant? Because so many these startups don't make it at the SBIR 3 phase.
So this question on acquisition policy is there are a variety of tools that the government can use. However, there are also limits. For example, a frequent limit that comes up with SBIR 3 awards is an anti-deficiency thing. Often you have to wait for funding to become available from a future year, so the government can't just indicate advance notice of award. Some of the things that the PPB Commission has done in its report, its recommendations, could create additional flexibilities, which could be delegated down to program managers and contract officers, which could allow flexibility, allow in the same year flexing of priorities, of being able to maybe move some money that isn't being put to good purpose to advancing, say, an SBR Phase 3 award.
Following up on that a little bit, I think it's important to note that right now the National Academies is running a study on recertification of the CIBR-SITR process for just this very reason. And as Dan mentioned, we in this PPBE report talked about how if we didn't have so many discrete budget line elements, but had more capability elements, we could allow the PEOs and PMs to have more agility, especially in the year of execution, to move money towards emerging technologies and these smaller companies. Right now, unfortunately, in my opinion, the CIBR-SITR process is an afterthought for most PEOs and PMs. There is not a lot of education on it, and it's a little bit trickier to use. So again, educating the workforce is critical.
Thank you, Mr. Khanna. Mr. Gates, sir, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
March 7th of this year, aviationtimes.com reported that the TR3 software delay could force the DoD to combat code F-35s. I don't know what it means to combat code something. Sounds dangerous. So maybe, Ms. Lord, we could draw on your experience and you could explain what combat coding is and whether that's a good idea.
I'm not sure I totally know the definition of combat coding, but it sounds like coding on the go. I will say that F-35 is the perfect example of a program that looked to our major primes who are absolutely critical for our national security, but frankly, to a large degree, has excluded the small companies where the predominance of innovation in this country takes place. And that's where the coding capability is. And I think having lived through the TR3 drama, if you will, We need to decompose this and make sure when we're awarding these large contracts that we are reaching out to the companies who know how to do this coding and, again, manage risk, don't eliminate risk, and find a way to bring them
So
in.
here's our challenge that we have with a lot of these companies. They are dying to get the contract. They do all sorts of things to get these big old contracts, to get these, $180 million a copy F-35s. And then they want to protect their source code and not allow other innovators to be able to access it to kind of springboard and innovate off of it. Dr. Murray, is the F-35 one of these kind of hardware-dominated paradigm systems where the upgrades that are needed for the warfighter are now being executed through this combat coding system?
I don't know whether or not the combat coding system is being used there, but it's certainly the case that it is a large hardware program that is used, from what I can tell, a very traditional DoD process to decide.
And you mean
what
that
to
as
do.
a critique, not
Yeah,
as a
yes,
compliment.
as a critique, I
Right.
agree. And the software components of that, again, some software components, the embedded flight control code is not something you should be changing every day. Other parts that are doing the logistics change and other things are things that we want to be agile about and we want to take advantage of. And so how do we, in those programs, say, not that we should break the rules because now there's a crisis and so we're going to do it differently, but rather we have a well-defined way of putting software in there, of checking, of doing continuous ATOs. Of part of our process is that we know what's the frequency at which we're going to update the different pieces of software. I think when you look at the
And what they'd
F-35,
love
you
to
should ask
say
that.
to us is, oh, you need to update it frequently, and we need to be sole source. And of course, we can't share our source code with anyone else so that they might be able to participate in that update. So how do I break through that?
Yeah, I think it's a great question, and and I'll let Dan say a little bit about it. I do think that you have to think about where the pieces of software are going to come from, and they don't all have to come necessarily from one manufacturer. Look at the software.
We'll have to wake Lockheed Martin up with smelling salts. That not every update to the F-35 has to come through Lockheed Martin.
Yeah, so first let me just add some operational context to this. Sometimes I think that in peacetime, it's hard to understand how important delivering software updates is. But if you just look at the conflict playing out in the Ukraine, one of the things is you see Ukrainian radios only last about 3 weeks before some countermeasure comes along and they have to reprogram the radio or change a waveform. We see the Excalibur munition, its targeting system dropped from 70% effectiveness to 6% effectiveness over a matter of a few months as new EW mechanisms came out. If we expect our major weapons system programs to follow these waterfall processes where we spend years planning a tech refresh, how do you ever hope to adapt in competition?
But that's what we're doing now.
That's right.
Well,
This is the problem.
Help us liberate ourselves from this.
So much of it is going to go back to, there's two principles. And Congressman, you introduced, so one, we've talked a little bit about ATOs already, that's one. The other principle you just brought up is this notion of vendor lock. One, I want to point out that an ATO is another mechanism via which one can achieve vendor lock. We're beginning to see this already. Some companies get a continuous ATO, and then they seek to use that to lock themselves in because it's so expensive. Companies can spend $1 million just getting through an ATO process. But there are a set of principles, and these are known as the MOSA principles. And actually, Congress put these in place, and Ms. Lord oversaw a number of efforts. But these are poorly used. What MOSA principles do is they say the program manager, who's in charge of the acquisition, shall define modules and interfaces and make those interfaces available to qualified contractors, to the government. And what this does is this allows other companies to come along, they see the data, they see the interface, and they can make new software that works with that. If the government has the right infrastructure, it can figure out how to test this and make sure that it works effectively in context. So the principles exist. In fact, put in law, they're just poorly adopted.
Well, yeah, because people are protecting their turf. I greatly appreciate that. I've got further questions for you, Dr. Murray, about AI and hypersonics, but I see my time's expired, and so I'll be submitting those for the record. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Ms. Slotkin, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Thanks for being here. I was at the Pentagon for 7 years, and in the 5-ish years that I've been here, we've done a ton of hearings that kind of look at this issue from one way or another, just our cultural problem of speeding up decision-making, particularly as it relates to tech. And to the point where I feel like, to use a Pentagon term, we're admiring the problem. Like, we love a hearing about it. And actually, there's deep bipartisan agreement on the need to spin up and to speed up that string on going from concept to fielding a technology of any kind, obviously software being some of the most complicated. And it has led me to believe, even as someone who cares deeply about the Pentagon and our national security, that it's not, any one program or any one authority. It's truly culture across administrations, culture across leaders. And I'm not like a burn it down kind of person, saying like, okay, the system doesn't work, so we need to destroy it and start from zero. But if separating yourself from the tech, if you could make, and some of you have served inside the Pentagon, if you could be queen or king for the day on one cultural change, what would that be? And I would say, aware of the fact that the Pentagon has a lot of rules and restrictions when they use taxpayer dollars that Google and Silicon Valley and everyone else doesn't have to adhere to. The responsibility of stewarding those dollars is different than a small startup in Palo Alto. It's never going to be the same thing. That comparing the two is apples to oranges. But speaking from culture, as people who have been either in the inside or adjacent, what's the one thing you would change, starting with Ms. Lord?
I would ask leadership to demonstrate that smart risk management benefits the warfighter and the nation. Therefore, I believe there are many more motivations and rewards that can be given to those individuals, whether civilians or in uniform, who lean forward and take smart risks. They manage risk, they don't try to eliminate it, and they move at the speed of need here. And I believe that leadership needs to speak up and make rewards and highlight those individuals who are doing the right thing, and recognize that people will falter, and not to blame them, if you will, when everybody's looking for perfect being the enemy of good enough.
Yeah, I certainly know in Silicon Valley, when I have the chance to visit, it's like people wear their mistakes as a badge of honor. I started a company, it didn't succeed, but I learned these important lessons, and now I'm on my third company and look at all this amazing stuff. It was so strange as a Pentagon official to visit Silicon Valley and hear people talking about their failures, because at the Pentagon, you would never talk about your failures, right?
Well, and with all due respect, I think Congress has a piece of this.
For sure. Sir, we'll just go down the line here, Mr. Murray.
Yeah, so I think it's a great question. I think you're right. Changing that culture is going to be hard, and how do we do it? I think there are lots of things we could do. If I could, sort of be king for a day, I think one of the things I would do is change the way we think about the teams of people who are working on software. If you look at what happens in Silicon Valley or other places, you see a lot of this turnover, right? People are not there for 10, 20, 30 years doing this, right? They come in for 2 years, they do this part, they go out, they start another company, they go another place. How do we take advantage of the commercial sector, bring them into government for a short period of time, put them in a position that is skipping a couple of GS levels and other things, because they're super talented, they know what to do, we get them in there. I think they'll help change that culture, because they'll ask why. Why are we doing it this way? Why don't we do it this way? I know how to do it that way. So I think that's what I would do, right? We have to change the culture. We're not going to change the culture by just taking the people who are there and saying change. I think we do that by bringing people in who look different and think about things differently, right? And that is one way to do it.
Great. And very quickly in my remaining time, Dr. Pratt.
Yeah, I think fostering a culture of doers is really the key here, which is encouraging the accountability down to an individual program manager for the outcomes they achieve. When you run a decades-long development and you only serve in a position for a few years, it's very hard to have a sense of accountability or responsibility or pride in the outcomes that get delivered. But if the great thing about software is you can compress these delivery timelines, and suddenly you can start to celebrate this. And combined with the suggestion that Dr. Murray just made of bringing in people for short tours of duty from commercial industry, I think you can get a vibrancy and dynamism in the perspective and talent to drive to results.
Thanks very much. My time. I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Slotkin. Mr. McCormick, you're recognized for 5 minutes, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And thank you to the witnesses for being here today. I'm going to start. It's fascinating. I love the variety of questions. It's kind of been all over the map, and you guys have been such great subject matters experts. I'm going to go a little off the chart of things I was supposed to ask today, because I'm fascinated by this topic. And we have a couple doctors in technological fields. I'm a doctor in medicine. And it's interesting to watch how AI has been developed and how it's taken these columns, very similar to the way the brain is. This is kind of fascinating for the kids out there, and how AI is developed in different parts of your brain affect different parts of your body. Specifically, it's designed for this part of your brain for your arm, this part for your leg, this part for your eyesight, this part for your hearing, this is your decision-making, this is your personality. And we've done the same thing in AI since we can no longer rely on Moore's law to shrink the size of these chips. And there's one atomic structure of thinness per layer, which is fascinating to me, that we can actually design software to go into this hardware and fit into these capacities to do specific functions just like we do in our brain. It's fascinating that after all this technology and all this science, we're getting back to the way that God designed the brain. It's fascinating to me. My question is, and this is for my two technology experts, is as we do this and we're designing software to match the hardware, and we're going forward, and AI accelerates that process, how does it affect cybersecurity and our enemies' ability to combat us, and how do we unleash that potential as we design the software going forward?
I'll give it a start. So, as I said earlier, I think it is hard for us to predict the impact that AI is going to have. It's clear it's going to be huge, and we have to figure out how to take advantage of that. Our adversaries are going to take advantage of that, and so if we're not on the front end of that, right, we're in trouble. I think one of the things we have to do is start saying we need to be using AI to design software. We need to be using AI to test software. We need to be using AI to try and attack software internal to what we're doing, right? Where is that happening now, right? What are the AI programs that are saying, hey, we write code with AI, we test code with AI and other things? Why? Because if we're not smart at that, right, we're not going to be able to take advantage as that technology goes so quickly. It's fascinating, I think, because AI is one of those areas. I heard a talk by John Hennessy, former president of Stanford, and he said AI is one of those areas where the developers of the technology were legitimately surprised by what it could do. They didn't know that it would be able to code. They didn't know it would be able to do these things. It's amazing, right, to have that. John Hennessy's been involved in a lot of things, but it did what they designed it to do. AI is something that truly is moving faster than we thought it would move. I think it's going to be huge. I think the DoD needs to take advantage of that. I think we ought to be asking, where are the AI efforts that are happening in use of large language models for coding and other things?
And Dr. Patt, before you get started, one of the things I also want you to consider as a university kind of guy too, Georgia Tech has 3 different columns of AI development, but we also have 250,000 students from India just alone here in the United States studying. We got a ton of kids from China studying. And we have all of our AI production over in Taiwan at TSMC, right? So we have production overseas. We have our technologies going back overseas. That's another consideration I want to, how do we protect this stuff from being used against us when we're training those people and producing the chips overseas in a nation that's, we said we're going to take over? I'm just concerned about the security measures of that.
An important question. The complexity of our software and our hardware and the co-design is absolutely exploding. I will say, though, that you can use this complexity as a tool. For example, one of the things you can do is you can create a chip, you can produce the hardware, and then you can set features of it later. You can defer some of that, and you can build in forms of defense. But at the same time, I don't think it's possible to prevent all vulnerabilities beforehand. This is one of the reasons why being able to go back and drive updates, detect anomalies, detect problems, and drive updates is so important. And we begin to see this now, for example, in some of the Navy operational networks of automated anomaly detection, and then they're able to go push a patch before any users see a problem. So tools like this of figuring out how to use this exploding complexity that we see to the advantage of the U.S. is how we stay ahead.
Okay, thank you. And I just, Ms. Lord, I'm going to just kind of push that question back on you again. Once we always talk about securing our software as we develop. We're the leaders in technology as far as developing software, but we don't create our own hardware when it comes to AI. How do we protect our technologies from the bad guys?
I think what we have to do is look at this from both a defensive and offensive point of view. And it's absolutely critical that we have standards that are held to when we look at the system level, that we also understand the provenance of all hardware and software that we include. Right now, we don't always understand the beneficial ownership of some of the companies in our supply chain. And frankly, AI has done an incredible job in illuminating supply chains, just scraping publicly available information to really understand understand where items began. So the Department of Defense has begun to put some contracts in place to use that technology, and cybersecurity standards are already to some degree in the acquisition policies, but that needs to be followed up on.
Thanks, I yield. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. McCormick. Mr. Ryan, sir, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you all for being here, and really appreciate your input and also your service in many various hats to the country. Despite my desire to ask about TikTok, I'm not gonna do that this morning. I'm sure many in our audience would be curious, myself included. I want to follow up on my colleague Ms. Lotkins' sort of line of questioning and something specifically you said, Ms. Lord. You started to say Congress has a role in this discussion about culture and risk, changing the risk sort of appetite, if you will, and tolerance. Could you talk a little bit more about that, any specific ideas you have, and we'll turn it to others too.
Absolutely. I think often it's easy to look at what has gone wrong in DOD and pound on that a little bit, if you will. But I think perhaps if thoughtful questions about what did you learn from this, how did it happen, how do we do things differently in the future, that line of discussion would be very useful. Also, I think asking questions about what is holding you back from taking more risks. And I think that there's an incredible fear of failure. And if you could engage senior leadership in the building relative to discussions about that and ask them how you motivate and reward them to act more like the commercial sector, where we do things quickly. We pull the patches, in a day or so. I think that would be really, really useful.
Just in setting up others to answer too, and somewhat leading, but is there, not to overly formalize it, but do you think it could ever make sense for there to be some more public or more broad assessment of which programs, which leaders, which individuals are accepting risks, sort of holding them up in a somewhat more formal way?
Absolutely. For years, when I was in the building, we talked about holding hearings to showcase these types of individuals. And I believe the reality is that scheduling does not allow you to do that type of thing. There are things like TikTok that you need to work about. To talk about and work on, but there is so much you can do just with recognition, with letters, with talking to the media, inviting people up to your office for an hour or so. Just doesn't cost much, would go a long way, and it would cast a very long shadow.
Thank you, Dr. Murray.
So, I think Congress does play a role in shaping the culture of the DoD, and it's the way you ask the questions, I think, in part, right? If you do something where you say, here are all the requirements, why didn't you meet these requirements, why is it over budget, et cetera, you are forcing us into a system in which we're looking at the requirements and checking all the boxes, and that may not be the right answer. If you look at speed and cycle time as your main metrics, and for software programs, that's what it is, how quickly can you get something out into the field? That's fantastic. Can we get a leaderboard going, to your point, right, where we sort of say, this program, right, they've got their sort of time down to 1 week or 2 weeks, why is it that they're doing better? Maybe we get people in a friendly competition, right, for saying we've got the best speed and cycle time, right? Can we make those things public? Can we say, here's how quickly these different software-dominated programs can get things out into the field and working?
Thank you. Love the leaderboard.
One of the most remarkable technological achievements is just how safe civil air travel is. It's remarkable how few fatalities come out of this. And the reason that it became so safe and so successful is there was a strong culture around a blame-free debrief, which is if you step forward and you talk about the problem, then it's about learning. It's not about failure. This is the same principle that we need to apply here as we figure out collectively how to do software right. Just to call out two specific examples, many of you have heard of this Air Force project called Kessel Run, which is about software delivery. Many of you have also heard about the Air Force's ABMS, the Advanced Battle Management System, that's run by PEOC-3BM in the Air Force, General Cropsey. Both of those efforts are efforts which did deep, hard introspection about their early efforts. And they said, you know what? We need to pivot. The early choices that we made around architecture and how to approach this, or how we think about managing this effort, aren't right, and we need to pivot. Those are the kinds of people, the kind of decision, and that sort of blame-free culture, that focus on learning that you need to make this work.
I appreciate that. And I think just with the 20 seconds I have left, I think recognizing that that has to start from the very, very top and has to be a principle of all the senior leadership is just something that I think we can hopefully all agree. So thank you, Mr. Chair. Yield back the balance.
Thank you, Mr. Ryan. Mr. Khanna, closing statement?
I just want to thank the excellent witnesses and your very concrete recommendations, and appreciate your time. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you again as well. Coming in, shedding light and amplifying information of, again, we've talked about it. We learn more from our failures than we ever will our successes. To your point, sir, in the military, we often never spoke about how well the operation went. We always talked about how horrible the small things were in order to capitalize that on the next op. I've been sitting back here trying to, I think I have it, but I'm not going to say it out loud. I think I know why the reason why we're so risk adverse in the House of Representatives. And I'll keep that with myself since I'm on TV right now. But my colleagues and I will definitely discuss that behind closed doors. But again, thank you. So members will have 5 business days to submit their questions for the record. This committee is now adjourned.